Emily thought she was just helping a dying veteran write a letter. But 3 days later, an anonymous invitation pulled her into a mystery buried for 56 years. What happened next changed everything. Henry Woodrow had spent weeks in the hospice without a single visitor. He barely spoke, kept to himself, and never asked for anything. He just lay in room 203, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Emily Carter, a 27-year-old nurse, had seen men like him before, veterans who carried more ghosts than memories. But there was something different about Henry. It was in the way he watched the door, the way his fingers twitched against the blanket, the way his eyes carried something heavy, something unfinished. One night, as she made her rounds, Henry finally spoke. "Nurse, help me write a letter." His voice was weak but steady. Emily frowned. He had never asked for anything personal before. "Of course," she said, reaching for a notepad. "Who should I send it to?" Henry let out a slow breath, something like a dry chuckle. "He'll find you." She hesitated. "Oh, that's not how mail works, Henry." But his expression didn't change. He just started speaking, and she started writing. His words came out clear, like he had carried them for a long time, like they were burning to get out. "Don't be afraid. Everything they told you about that day was a lie. I wanted the truth to come out, but I failed. Now, it's your turn." When she finished, she folded the letter carefully. "Are you sure you don't want me to address it?" Henry studied her, as if making a decision. Then, for the first time, he smiled. "Thank you," he murmured. "Now I can go." The next morning, he was gone. Emily had seen death before. Some people fought it, some slipped away peacefully. Henry belonged to the second group, but something about the way he let go, it felt too easy, too final. She placed his letter in the bottom drawer of her locker and tried to forget about it. She almost did. Until 3 days later. 3 days later. She came home exhausted, kicked off her shoes, and was about to collapse on the couch when she saw it. An envelope, lying on the floor, no return address. Her pulse quickened as she picked it up, tore it open. Inside was a single slip of paper. "Come, you need to see this." Tucked behind it, a plane ticket. One way, New York. Emily turned the envelope over, running her fingers along the edge. The seal was identical to the one she had placed in Henry's hands, but she had never mailed it. A chill crawled down her spine. Some secrets refused to stay buried. Curiosity won over caution. Emily had debated all the way to the airport during the flight, and in the taxi ride to Brooklyn, whether this was the dumbest thing she had ever done. But now, standing in front of the towering brownstone, she realized something. Whatever this was, it was bigger than she had imagined. The house had that old money elegance, the kind that didn't scream for attention, but whispered power from every brick. The door was solid oak, the kind that didn't just keep people out, but kept secrets in. Before she could even knock, it swung open. A woman stood in the doorway, mid-50s, crisp white blouse tucked into a fitted navy skirt. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable. Everything about her radiated control. "Emily Carter." The voice was smooth, deliberate. Emily nodded. "Come in." The moment she stepped inside, the air shifted. This wasn't just a home. It was a museum of another time. Oil paintings, antique furniture, a faint scent of old books and polished wood. It felt like history itself lived in these walls, watching. But Emily wasn't alone. 3 people were waiting in the sitting room. An older man, neatly dressed in a tailored suit, with the kind of posture that screamed military. A young woman in her 20s, shifting in her chair, her fingers nervously tapping against the armrest. And a tall guy in his 30s, arms crossed, face set in a deep scowl. Emily hesitated in the doorway. "Why am I here?" she asked, glancing between them. The older man spoke first. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something weighted. Because you hold the key to a mystery we've been trying to solve for over 50 years. Emily blinked. The woman who had let her in stepped forward and set a faded photograph on the coffee table. Emily leaned in, her breath catching. It was an old military photo. 5 young men in uniform, grinning for the camera. Henry Woodrow was one of them, but it wasn't the smiles that caught her attention. It was their eyes. Despite their forced grins, their eyes told a different story. Shadows clung to them, the kind that never really left a person. The older man picked up the photo and traced a finger over it. "This man," he said, tapping on Henry's face, "saved our lives in 1968. His voice was steady, but Emily heard something else there, too. Gratitude, yes, but something heavier. Guilt? He set the photo back down. "But something happened that day, and Henry sent you here because he wanted the truth to come out." A chill ran down Emily's spine. This wasn't just about an old man trying to make peace with his past. This was something else entirely. And whatever it was, she had just walked right into the middle of it. Emily could feel it now, that slow, creeping sense that she had stepped into something far bigger, far darker than she had ever expected. She took a steadying breath and looked at the older man, his lined face grim, his eyes carrying the weight of too many years. "What happened?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but firm. The man exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "Henry took the fall for something he didn't do, and he paid for it every day of his life." Emily's fingers curled against her palms. The room was silent for a moment, like no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Finally, the tall man with his arms crossed stepped forward. 1968, Vietnam. Henry's unit was accused of something terrible. Emily's breath caught. "What do you mean, accused?" The young woman, still tapping her fingers against the armrest, finally spoke. Her voice was tense, almost bitter. They were blamed for killing civilians." Emily's stomach twisted. The older man nodded. "It wasn't true, but that didn't matter." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and for the first time, his voice cracked just slightly. Someone had to take the blame. The brass wanted a scapegoat, and Henry stepped forward. He didn't defend himself, didn't fight it. He let them call him a monster so the rest of us could walk free. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. Henry Woodrow, the quiet, solemn man she had sat beside in his final days. The man who had thanked her like she had given him something more than just paper and ink. He had carried this for 56 years. "Why?" she whispered. The older man met her eyes. Because if he hadn't, we all would have gone down with him, and he thought he could handle it, thought he could live with it." Emily shook her head, trying to process it. "So you all just let him?" Silence. The tall man shifted uncomfortably. The young woman dropped her gaze. The older man closed his eyes for just a second before looking at her again. "We were kids, Emily. We didn't understand what it meant. Not really. And by the time we did, it was too late." Emily clenched her jaw. Too late. That was easy to say. Too late meant Henry had lived an entire lifetime as a man marked as a traitor. Too late meant that the people who should have protected him had watched in silence as his name was dragged through the mud. Too late meant that even at the very end, he had to ask a hospice nurse, a stranger, to help clear his name. Her breath was shaky as she looked at the older man again. Then why now? Why send the letter now? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into a folder sitting beside him and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Emily recognized it instantly. Her handwriting, her words, the letter she had written for Henry, word for word. Read it," he said quietly. Emily's eyes scanned the page, but she didn't have to. She already knew what it said. "I have carried someone else's secret for 56 years. But now, at the end, I want the truth to stand. I was not guilty. I saved them. And now they must save me. Clear my name." Emily's hands shook. She lifted her eyes, burning now with something she hadn't quite processed until this moment. "He died with the world calling him a traitor." The older man swallowed. "Yes." "And you all just..." She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. "You all just let it happen?" No one spoke. Emily felt something hot rise in her chest. Anger, grief, frustration. She looked down at the letter again. Henry had spent his entire life keeping their secret, and in return, they had let him rot in silence. She clenched her fists. He spent 56 years carrying this for you. He died with this weight on his shoulders. She raised her head, her voice steady now, sharp. So, what are you going to do about it? For weeks, Emily fought for Henry's truth. What started as a quiet search turned into a full-scale battle. With his family and former brothers-in-arms by her side, she pushed for a formal review of his case. The story spread fast. News outlets picked it up, veterans spoke out, and the weight of silence finally shattered. Men who had once buried the truth came forward. Documents long hidden in classified files surfaced. Piece by piece, Henry's story was rebuilt, not as a traitor, but as a hero. And then, 3 months later, the military issued its final statement. Henry Woodrow was officially exonerated. The ceremony. The air was crisp at Arlington. The ceremony was quiet, but powerful. A military officer stepped forward, voice steady. On behalf of the United States Armed Forces, we formally recognize the wrongful accusation against Sergeant Henry Woodrow and restore his honor. A folded flag was placed in his family's hands. His name was cleared. Emily stood among them, watching as the truth finally took its place. She looked at Henry's framed photograph, young, full of life, smiling like the future was his. And she understood. This wasn't coincidence. It was meant to be.